Good day to the students in historiography. This video and PowerPoint will discuss analyzing sources, looking at the definition of primary sources and secondary sources, and then talking about some things that might be valuable in looking at these things. I will be posting I'll be sending to you a handout that'll help you as you go through this. You may want to print that out before you watch the video. Primary sources are very important to historical study. It would be virtually impossible to do a lot of serious work without primary sources. In Presnell's text, she gives this definition that primary sources are items that are directly associated with their producer or user and the time period in which they were created. Examples include diaries, newspaper articles, government documents, clothing, photographs, oral interviews, and news broadcasts. A primary source reflects the authority and perspective of someone who directly experienced what they are describing. Now, I put an asterisk there by the word clothing, and I have a note where she says clothing, I would say artifact. Any item from the time can become a primary source if you try to extrapolate some historical interpretation from that artifact. Now, of course, that can be a problem. The value of primary sources is they are firsthand accounts. They are accounts of people who were actually involved, or at least they lived through the time. A letter from a housewife during the Civil War. She didn't experience battle, but she experienced the home front, and she can tell us about that aspect of the time and the events that we are studying. Another value of primary sources, it often helps us to get into social history, to look at what ordinary common people were thinking and doing. Sometimes, though, you can get primary sources that are so specific, they may not be able to help you a great deal. For example, if you found a diary of someone who ran a general store in a frontier town, that can probably tell you a lot. But a person who ran a taxidermy shop in a frontier town, that's a pretty specialized niche. Didn't have near as many customers as the general store. And so while it might tell you about that particular type of business or the kind of work that artisans or craftsmen did, it may not help you get a very broad picture of the time that you're dealing with. Primary sources also add the human interest element. You have people in their own words, often very colorful language, telling you what they experienced. You're also free to draw your own conclusions. No writer or narrator is giving you an interpretation. Now, when you're looking at primary sources that have been collected in some book or article, you do have to be aware that there could be a bias present in the selection process. So primary sources are very valuable, but there are some problems with them. First of all, they may be biased. If a person was involved in something that was somewhat controversial, there may be a tendency in what they record to try to cover their own rear, to justify their own action. Some of you may have heard me talk about in different classes my oldest brother, James R. Joy, was a Marine officer. He was involved in the Easter Offensive in 1972. Most American fighting troops were gone from Vietnam except for air power. But he was a Marine advisor to a unit of South Vietnamese Marines. Well, during the Easter Offensive, some Army advisors in the northern part of South Vietnam evacuated, but some of the lower level Army advisors they did not leave. And Colonel Gerald Turley, a Marine officer who was my brother's commander, he took on the responsibility of trying to coordinate and guide the work of these Army advisors. Later, he is criticized for this. He wasn't in the chain of command. He was not an Army officer. He wrote a firsthand account of the Easter Offensive, just called the Easter Offensive. And when I read that, knowing this background, I could see that he was at times trying to show why he did what he did. Obviously, this was not standard military procedure, but what was he supposed to do? Just let these men not have any leadership? Now, primary sources, even if they are biased, they might be valuable. Propaganda or extremely political or extremely polemical or political, things like you might see in a political campaign, they may not be accurate, but they can give you a good feel for what people thought and believed. For example, you can look at cartoons from the 1890s about the populace, and they are often very biased, very anti-populist. So they're not accurate, but they are accurate in telling you this is how some people saw them, or how some opinion makers wanted people to see them. Another thing that can be a problem with things like polling results and things like that, people may well lie on polls and questionnaires. If they asked you in high school, are you engaged in premarital sex? I know good and well some people that weren't said they were so that they'd sound cool. And some people that were said no because they're afraid somebody, even though they tell you, oh, this is all anonymous, it's entirely confidential, they believe somebody's going to know. Another problem is they might simply misunderstand the question. On the slide here, I say a few years ago, it's more like probably 20 years ago, maybe even close to 30. There was a lot of things, there was a lot of attention in the news that a poll had been taken and a considerable percentage of the American people, according to this poll, didn't believe that the Holocaust happened. Well, obviously there are hardcore Holocaust deniers, but the way the question was phrased made it hard for people to know what they were supposed to respond. The question was something like, do you find it hard to believe something like this happened? Well, if I had been asked that, I would have said yes, perhaps. I find it hard to believe that one of the most advanced civilizations in Europe did something as evil and grotesque as the Holocaust. I have no doubt that it happened, but I find it hard to believe that it happened. So just how the question is asked can be a problem. Another problem with primary sources is limited scope. A person may be able to tell you what they experienced, but they don't necessarily know the big picture. My brother that fought in Vietnam, he can tell you what it was like to be in combat. He can tell you what it was like to be an advisor to South Vietnamese Marines that were in combat. He doesn't necessarily know any more about the overall picture of why we were in Vietnam than many scholars who never set foot in Vietnam. Remember the story of an Indian that fought at Little Bighorn. He said, all my life, I've heard people talk about what happened at Little Bighorn. I was there and all I saw was dust. So a primary source is a very narrow, limited picture sometimes. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when collections of sources have been put together for a certain purpose, there may be a bias skewing the selection of sources. For example, in recent years, historians have begun to note that when you look at the accounts of slavery published by abolitionist groups, they are probably true accounts, but probably the abolitionists picked the worst case examples. They were not trying to give a fair and balanced view of slavery. They weren't interested in publishing things where slaves said, yeah, you know, my master wasn't all that bad. They wanted to stir up opposition to slavery. And of course, most of us would agree with their goal. So you can't assume that this is just a fair sampling of all the accounts that you might have. And if primary sources are edited, meaning that the entire document is not given, then you have to wonder about, is this a fair sample? Some of you may remember in my US survey classes in the first chapter, whether you're in part 1 or part 2, the reader that we use by Holitz, it has a selection of examples from textbooks. And he wants you to see basically that the interpretation of things often varies with when it was written. But you do have to assume that he's giving you a fair sample. And I think probably in those chapters he is. But for example, if he says, you know, this is what this historian said about the role of the freed slaves in the Reconstruction era, if the historian actually had about twice as much and he's only given us half of it, that's not a fair sample. Now, I want to go on and talk about analyzing secondary sources. Usually when you're writing a undergraduate level paper, and even often on a master's level thesis, you're going to be primarily using secondary sources. And again, this quote is from Presna. Secondary works are analyses and interpretations based on primary sources and other sources, which can include other secondary works such as books and journal articles, and tertiary sources such as encyclopedia articles. A secondary source usually reflects the authority and perspective of a professional historian who did not experience what they are describing, but who is trained to analyze primary sources and contextualize them within a bigger picture. Now, a couple of comments on that. She refers to tertiary sources. I'm not sure that's how you pronounce it, but it means like third level, primary, secondary, and third level, such as encyclopedia articles. In scholarly books and journal articles in historical journals, I think it would be fairly rare to find an encyclopedia article cited. It might possibly be that an author might say, you know, for a brief overview of the background of this topic, you might look at this, but usually you won't see encyclopedia articles cited in books or scholarly articles. Another thing that I think is very important about this quote from Presnell is she talks about how historians are trained to analyze primary sources and contextualize them. Some people in teaching history think you should give the students nothing but primary sources. And I have always argued, kind of like in that movie, A Few Good Men, you can't handle the truth. Undergraduate students cannot handle primary sources if that's all you give them, because they don't have the context to understand what they're reading. For example, again, in Hollitz's book, in part 1 of US, there's a chapter that is all primary sources, and it's about what was colonial Pennsylvania like for poor people. If you came here, what was your chance of having a better life? Now, I do kind of wonder sometimes if he has stacked the deck there, that maybe he doesn't give us a really good sampling of the sources. But one thing I've noted, there is a graph or a chart in that chapter where it tells you how many acres of land did some of these people end up with. If you came here as an indentured servant, and then after your servitude, if you lived, which was a big if because many people did die, but if you lived, well, the majority of them ended up owning 50 acres or more. Well, a lot of students look at that and think, well, they must have been terribly poor then. They don't realize that in colonial Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania was the breadbasket of the colonies, some of the best land. A family farm of 40 acres, you're not going to get rich, but you're going to have a fairly decent life on that. They don't have the background to contextualize what they're reading. Now, when you're looking at secondary sources, how do you know which ones are good? First of all, you ask the instructor. If he or she doesn't know, they can probably tell you where to go to find the answer. And one thing about your research paper in any class of mine, and I imagine most instructors would have the same idea, if you come to me and I say, oh, the book you need to look at on that is such and such book by so-and-so, well, you better have that book in your paper. Kind of like my dad used to say, I put that tool in your hand and you didn't get that job done. Well, I told you the source you need. And if you didn't get it, that's going to be a problem. Now, another way of analyzing secondary sources is look at books in the field that are thought to be standard, reliable books. If these have an annotated bibliography, that is very helpful. If there's no bibliography, look at the sources the author refers to in the notes that the author has. Do certain authors keep appearing? Notice the names of authors that keep reappearing in lectures, textbooks, articles, and historical monographs. Also note if the author refers to other authors that have different views. Look at those sources also. In specialized encyclopedias or dictionaries, there often will be a bibliography or a for further reading list. Also look at the author of the article. He or she is likely a noted authority in the field, and you could look for other books or articles by this author. Certain publishers are important in certain fields. Most university presses are going to publish fairly reliable books. These books go through serious vetting or editing by editors and by blind referees. Blind referees means somebody sent the book without any knowledge of who the author was and asked to comment on it. That way you don't have personal biases like, oh yeah, I know that person. They studied under Professor so-and-so who I've hated all my life, so I'm going to trash their book. Now, when I say they publish fairly reliable books, that doesn't mean that all historians would agree with them, but it does mean that historians would generally say, well, the author made a good argument. I don't necessarily accept the conclusions, but they didn't do anything intellectually dishonest or cut corners in making their argument and using their sources. Some of the universities that I might mention, basically any state that was heavily involved in the Civil War, their state university presses will probably publish some important books on that. On the American West, the presses of the University of Oklahoma, University of Arizona, and University of Nebraska and University of New Mexico. They all have some important books in the American West. In Indian history, again, Oklahoma and Nebraska, Arizona, New Mexico, also California and Washington. Their presses turn out some pretty good books. On military history, the University of Kansas has a series that's fairly well accepted. Also, Texas A&M University. Certain series becomes noted for their quality. The American Nation was a set of, or the New American Nation series was a set of works started back in the 1930s or 40s maybe. Some of the works were never finished. Sometimes titles were reassigned to someone else because the original author never got it done. But generally, those are very high quality works. The Langer Seminar series, especially the European stuff, was very good. This was a series that was aimed at undergraduate students or beginning graduate students. My book on American expansionism is a part of this series, although I would have to say I don't think the books in American history have gained the kind of reputation that the original Langer Seminar series on European history did. Harlan Davidson publishes a series just called the American History Series, and I have used those often in classes because they are paperbacks that are fairly reasonable and often very good, and virtually every book has a bibliographic essay that gives you material for further study and things like that. Now, when you're looking at a particular scholar, what you want to think about is where did this scholar get his or her education? Who or what influenced this author? Teachers, other authors, schools of interpretation? What do other scholars think of this historian's work? Check book reviews where other scholars have reviewed their works. What publisher published this book, or what journal accepted this article? That tells you that if it's a reliable, well-established publisher or journal, then the scholar is probably recognized as an authority in their field. Now, I want to talk a little bit about using images. Usually in a research paper, students are not going to be using a lot of pictures. They might use charts or maps and things like that. Fresnel has quite a bit of material in her book about questions that you can ask when you're using pictures or artwork or films. Often they're kind of the same questions, but some of the main things to think about: why was this piece done? Whether it's a painting or a photograph, what was the motivation behind creating this? Now I want to look at some particular examples here. This is a well-known picture from the Civil War era of a dead soldier in an area at Gettysburg that was called the Devil's Den. It's been reprinted in many textbooks and specialized works over the decades. But a historian named William Frasanito, I think's how you pronounce his name. That's a picture of him there with his name. He's done a lot of research on Civil War pictures. And on that particular picture, he believes it's staged. He has looked at other things that were taken by the same photographer the same day. And that is a dead body, but it's not exactly the way it fell. The photographer moved things around to make the composition a little more interesting. Well, that's important to know if you're going to be referring to something. This is also, I believe, a picture that Brasanito's talked about. This is a picture of 3 Confederate prisoners of war captured after the Battle of Gettysburg. And you often see this in books or articles with a caption like, look at these men, they've been captured, but look at the determination and the steel in their character. But Brasanito points out these men were captured on July 5th. The Battle of Gettysburg ended on the 3rd, and on the 4th of July, Lee's army slipped away into Virginia. If these guys were captured on the 5th, there's a very good chance they were skulkers. They had run away from the battle, and they weren't with Lee's army when it withdrew. So a lot of the comments people have made about the picture may not have much foundation. This is a photographer from the late 19th century, although he lived clear up, died about 1952, I think, Edward Curtis. Beginning in the 1880s or 90s, he started into a series called the North American Indian. He believed that the Indian's way of life was largely dying out, and he wanted to capture some of it. Now, this was a series of 20 volumes that included 1,500 photos. And they were published between 1907 and 1930. Only about 300 sets of the whole series of 20 volumes were ever published. And I haven't been able to find what was the price at the time, but it was a very expensive set of books for that time. I believe the books came with pictures bound in it, but then also some of the photographs, you had a very high quality, almost like art quality print that was provided with it. This is one of the things that made it so expensive. But what is interesting about Curtis is it is well known that he often manipulated the scene. For example, this picture here, I believe it's some Blackfeet Indians. They are in a teepee. But there's another picture that shows just almost exactly right in between the 2 men. There was a little metal clock sitting there. Well, Curtis had that taken out. It's almost like, I want real Indians. I don't want Indians that are adapting some of the white man's ways. This is a picture that this is a book that reprints a lot of Curtis's works. Many of the things have been reprinted in cheaper formats. A set of the original 20 volumes sold at auction for a few years ago at over $1 million. But here you have some Plains Indians in kind of war dress. Well, at the time Curtis was taking these pictures, these Indians never dressed like this anymore. So he encouraged them, dress up in the old fashion. Now, some people think that was manipulative. One thing that's interesting, though, some Native American people think, you know, Curtis took a picture of my grandfather. It's the only picture we've ever seen. So they can have different attitudes about this. This is a picture by a photographer and social reformer named Jacob Riis, R-I-I-S was his last name. This is an area in New York City called Hell's Kitchen. And Riis was a reformer. So when you see pictures of him, pictures by him, you have to remember he's not really interested. If he found something beautiful and very, very nice about life among the poor in New York City, he probably didn't publish that widely. He's wanting to show how bad conditions are so that people will want to change things. This is a very famous picture by a photographer named Dorothea Lange. It's called Migrant Mother. This is the way it is often shown, but actually this is a cropping of a slightly bigger picture. But it really seems to capture kind of the disillusionment, hopelessness that a lot of people had during the Depression. Now, Dorothea Lange was a very good photographer, but you do have to remember she worked for the Farm Security Administration, and her assignment was to go out and take pictures that would kind of, it was almost like propaganda for the New Deal programs, to get people to support what the New Deal was trying to do. This is, I believe, the first picture that was taken of the raising of the flag on Mount Surabaki on the island of Iwo Jima in World War II, February 23rd, 1945. A photographer named Joe Rosenthal took this picture. He worked for the Associated Press. But actually, he took several pictures that day. I'm not sure this might have been the very first, but this is the picture that we've all seen hundreds of times. It also is the picture that the Marine Corps Memorial in Washington, D.C. was, the sculpture there is based on this picture. This was staged after the earlier pictures were taken. So again, that's something important to remember when you're using the photograph as evidence. This is a picture that's interesting because it raises a couple of questions. If you look at the picture, there's a line across the top. This is a glass negative, and that's a crack in the negative. Also, if you look at that picture, the nose and the eye on the right side are about the only thing in focus. The left side of the face and the right side back to the ear is not in focus. Now, you might think somebody going through, especially since this is a broken negative, they might think, well, you know, we've got plenty of pictures of Lincoln. Let's get rid of this thing. Well, it happens to be, as far as we know, this is the last picture taken of Abraham Lincoln. So even though it's not very good quality, it is very important. And by the way, a lot of those glass negatives of virtually anything, when photographers died, often that stuff was sold just for glass. And in a lot of greenhouses around the country, they made the roofs out of old photographic glass negatives. And of course, who knows what historical things have been lost through that process. Now, this is a painting. I know that you can't, that this is not a very good photograph of the painting, but this is Custer's Last Stand. And as you can see at the bottom there, Anheuser-Busch, St. Louis, Missouri. The Anheuser-Busch company commissioned this painting, and it was made into murals that used to hang behind the bars in many saloons around the country. I wouldn't swear you might possibly find one somewhere out in some little town in Montana or something. The point is, this picture is not very accurate at all, except maybe the terrain might be somewhat like what it was. But right in the middle, you have what's supposed to be Custer in buckskin. Now, Custer often did wear buckskin, but it's known on the day of the battle he was wearing his regular uniform. Something else you can't see in this picture, some of the Indians are carrying shields that are kind of, they're not round like Plains Indians often carried a relatively small round shield, but these were long, and if you've seen pictures of African tribes, like at the time of the Zulu War, they look more like that than anything used in North America. So, in other words, this is not very accurate, but it's significant because in those days, before television and internet and all that, this is what many people thought happened at Little Bighorn. I've seen that picture. Surely it must, why would they publish it if it wasn't accurate? Kind of like today, if it's on the internet, it's got to be true. So something like this can be very influential, but unfortunately, it's influencing people with some mistaken ideas. Now, the problem of kind of inherent bias in images extends even to the ideas of making maps, because obviously when you're making a map, you're trying to take a cylinder or globe shape and put it onto a two-dimensional paper. Now this is the Mercator projection that is commonly used. But this is one that many people think is probably a little more accurate. Again, I don't know enough about the science of all this to really know exactly why. But it is important to remember that when we are looking at maps, sometimes there is an interpretive idea. One thing that you have to remember often, like if you ask a group of students, probably even up to high school, draw a map of the world. Well, of course, most of us don't know too much. We could probably get the roughly basic idea of Africa, South America, North America, but we often make our own country much bigger than it really is. We kind of think that we are the center of the world. Well, this last picture, remember, things can be misleading. I was just telling my wife last night, and of course she was fascinated by this. I remember clear back when I was fairly young, most of you know I'm fairly conservative, but I have often hung out with people who are even more conservative than me. But somewhere I saw a picture circulated. Here's Martin Luther King at a Communist Party training camp. And I remember looking at that picture at the time, even in my tender youth, when I was a young skull full of mush. And I thought, there's nothing in that picture that tells you that's a Communist Party gathering. That could have been the Black Ministers Alliance of some town in Georgia or Alabama. Just because somebody puts a label on it we can't necessarily take that as truth. So when we use sources, whether they're printed or whether they're artwork or photography or maps, we always have to think about how reliable is this? And of course, when you put it into your paper, then if someone else reading it has reason to really doubt it, and if they would find out that it's not really depicting what you think it is, then obviously that's going to hurt your presentation. So these are some things to think about in the idea of analyzing sources. One more comment and then we'll stop for today. When I defended my doctoral dissertation, the last question I was asked by my major professor, the one that I did most of my work with, he asked me, "What have you learned from doing your dissertation?" I said, "I've learned that you have to look at sources very critically." And he said, "Well, I think that's about the best lesson we could have taught you." And that was high praise coming from him. He did not hand out compliments easily. So keep that in mind whenever you are writing anything, that you always have to look critically at the sources. Make sure that you understand them, that you are using them fairly and judiciously. You're not trying to make a source say something that it doesn't. So that is all for this video. So good night and good luck.